Okay, let's begin. I am Lanise Antoine Shelley, and I'll be your host through constructive healing-based conversations designed to empower adoptees and the adoption curious. Through the lens of experts and lived experiences, we focus on alchemizing our stories into maximum social impact. These are the voices who could not speak when they were young. You're the first person outside of the constellation that I've brought on the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, when I stumbled across your work, I was just like, I have to speak to this person. Your work is so important. What you have to say, how you're saying it, your book is riveting. I have just about underlined every passage because I'm just like, yes, it's so affirming. I'm being rocked by it and by this knowledge. I think every adoptee should have access to your work specifically. So yeah, we're gonna launch this last season with you and what you've been up to, because again, as I said, it's imperative that people are aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it.
Thank you.
Where did you launch into your investigation of adoption, adoptees, birth parents? I know that you don't delve too deeply into the adoptee perspective, but your research in birth families, birth mothers is extraordinary. How did that even start for you?
So I started doing research on adoption back in 2010. And at the time, I was working with an organization in Boston that did support for pregnant and parenting teenagers and young mothers. And so it actually had nothing to do with adoption, but it was about figuring out how to support young people who were raising their children and how to get them the supports that they needed. So a lot of them were trying to find access to housing, to childcare programs, to food assistance, the things that would allow them to care for their families. And I was really inspired by the incredible young parents that we were working with and their determination to find a path forward to care for their children in a way that would be sustainable. And at the time, 16 and Pregnant had just started airing on MTV. And of course, a lot of the young mothers that we were working with were watching this show. We were all watching this show. And there was a narrative on that first season around adoption and around a couple who had relinquished their daughter, Carly, for adoption. And they were portrayed as very selfless, very mature. They were portrayed as better parents for having relinquished their daughter for adoption. And I'm, again, looking at these incredible young women that I'm working with who are just so inspiring to me. And the idea that giving up their children would have made them better parents in a way pointed to the contradictions of who adoption is theoretically and actually serving in our culture. And so I wanted to really understand more deeply how adoption impacted the lives of the mothers who did relinquish their children. Why were they engaging with the adoption system at all? What did it mean for them longer term? And at the time, I was a graduate student. This was my dissertation work. I didn't know that I would be doing that data collection for 10 years. But I think it was actually really important to do the follow-up data collection 10 years later and to see how people's feelings about the adoptions had changed over time. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more, but that was really how it started, was seeing the contrast between the struggle of parenting on the margins and parenting without support and what that looked like for people, and seeing the ways that adoption was framed as this panacea, right? Adoption is going to be the solution here. And I wanted to probe that more deeply.
I read the chapter with that couple from 16 and Pregnant, and it was an example of one of the many myths about adoption where the birth parent goes skipping into the sunset. Like Juno was an example in the book of where she's riding her bike and feels free from the burden of the pregnancy. Speaking to all of the myths that are just prevalent in adoption in general, what are some key myths that you want to highlight for people? You don't have to say all of them so that they read your book, but some myths that really haunt us, especially adoptees. What are some of those?
Yeah, there are so many, right? I think the first one is that the women who are relinquishing their children don't want to parent. Almost all of the mothers that I interviewed wanted to parent their children. That was their first choice. And they turned to adoption when parenting felt very impossible. They either didn't have the support that they needed, the resources that they needed, the time that they needed to get their lives to a place where they felt that they could care for a child the way that they wanted to. But they all had that desire to figure it out. And with some more support or more structure or someone else giving them a different vision for how this could go, that was their preference, really. So I think that's a really important myth, because we have this idea that women are freely choosing adoption and that's their first choice. And this is just a question of like equal choices, and we should empower people to make choices. But it's actually about understanding the ways that adoption is a reflection of constraint on choices, and the way that adoption is what happens when people don't feel other things are possible. And I've heard from some adoptees who say, that they've tried to reach out to their family of origin and their parents and have been rejected, and really feeling that these are people who actually just 100% weren't interested in parenting. Unfortunately, I'm sure that some of those people exist, but that is not the majority of who I spoke to. That wasn't the normative experience. And I will also say the trauma of the separation works for the relinquishing parents too. So I think that the circumstance around a pregnancy and a parenting decision for a baby can make it hard to have connections later on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those parents didn't want to have their child if they could at the time. So that, I think, is a really important myth. The second myth, and I know a lot of adopted people are not going to be surprised by this myth, but this is one that I try to talk about all the time when I'm talking to people who are outside the adoption space, because we have this idea that there are so many babies in need of homes, that adopting is really an altruistic thing, that we need more people to want to adopt, when actually within the private adoption system, we have so many more families who want prospective parents who want to adopt than we have children available. So when you look at the private adoption system, there are up to 45 waiting prospective parents for every baby that's available. So you have really high demand and very low supply of babies. And I'm intentionally using this market language of supply and demand, even though it's uncomfortable when we're talking about people. But I think it's important to understand that we are talking about a market. You have high demand, low supply. And so you're going to have a lot of players that, one, can make a lot of money off of this, and that, two, are really motivated to increase the available supply of children to meet this market demand. And that's where you have some for-profit agencies. Most agencies are nonprofit, but they're still motivated to facilitate adoptions in order to maintain their existence as an organization. And you also have for-profit brokers that are continually inserting themselves, working with prospective parents, nonprofit agencies, for-profit agencies, independent attorneys, to try to really aggressively advertise and promote adoption to vulnerable pregnant people. And I think that idea, this myth that we have that we need more people to adopt, this is really altruistic. Actually, the high demand is what drives the adoption industry. So I think that is another really important myth. And people whose everyday lives are shaped by adoption, they tend to know this, but people outside of the system are often really surprised by that. So that's a myth that I try to surface quite a lot.
They're so surprised by that, and oftentimes they deny it, because when I talk to my friends about the work that I'm doing as an adoptee advocate, they don't quite understand that it is supply and demand, that there is a surge of potential parents that want a child, and therefore the government or the community makes a child available. They don't understand that is more often than not the process. If you've seen One Child Nation, which I'm sure you've seen, along with Rabbit Proof Fence, which is another great one. I love that film. I see myself in those little girls. One time I was talking to a close friend of mine who had just had a baby, and she's holding her 1 year old in her arms, and she doesn't quite understand why it's PA language to say that it is supply and demand. And so I looked at her and I said, what situation would you have to be in for you to relinquish your child? And she just started to panic. I saw her eyes get big and she clutched her child to her chest even tighter. I said, exactly. You would have to be in some dire situation. You're back against the wall on your knees, keening, for you to give him up. So why do you think that it's as simple as a better life or relinquishment is something that comes easily for these birth parents? And I love that you brought up the fact that there is birth parent trauma as well. And that's something that I didn't grow up thinking about until a few years ago when I was looking at my biological siblings' profiles on Facebook. And I saw my little sister had pictures of me, all these pictures of me that she had just taken, extracted from the interweb because I hadn't given them to her. And it dawned on me that my biological family, they were mourning me. I had never considered that. I just felt unwanted. I felt unworthy. And so many adoptees are just drenched with this idea that they're unwanted, that it was easy to relinquish them. So reading these stories from these women who said, I had no choice, I was coerced, not in ways in which they were physically strapped down and the child was taken violently from them, but there was misinformation, disinformation, there was manipulation. That is a level of coercion that these birth parents go through. And so it's essential for us to highlight that. And I felt that it was so healing in reading your book because understanding the trauma of birth parents is essential for us as adoptees to understand that there was value in our connection, but something happened and our value was never diminished because of that something that happened that forced them to relinquish us.
And I think that oftentimes when there's a struggle, when again, my research isn't on adopted people, but from stories that I've heard in discussing my research and being in conversation with the adoptee community, I know a lot of people struggle to have positive relationships with their families of origin. And that's why it was important for me to include stories from relinquishing mothers who aren't in good contact with their child. And to show the ways that those relationships are limited on their end by that trauma and by the structure of what the system of adoption offers them. But it's never about not wanting to have a relationship with their child. For example, one of the stories that I include is a woman who wanted to have an open adoption, had a sort of open adoption with her son when he was little. And what the open adoption required per the agreement was that they would have one in-person visit a year. And the adoptive parents were honoring that, but her son didn't know that she was his mother. So they would have these sort of annual meetings. Their tradition was to go to McDonald's and get Happy Meals and play on the playground there. But her son just thought that she was a friend of his mom's, didn't know that this was his birth mother. And she ended up really pulling back and cutting off contact because she said, these visits are really hard for me. They're really painful, right? They remind me of what I have lost. She was at that point raising a child of her own who knew that this was her brother. And she said, I can't keep these secrets anymore in my own life. But she didn't want to have She wanted to have a relationship with her son, but she didn't want to have the kind of interaction that the adoptive parents were willing to offer. It felt disingenuous. It felt like it was painful for her. And because he didn't know who she was, not beneficial to him too. Right. And so she ended up cutting off contact. And when I spoke with her again 10 years later, she had not seen him for those whole 10 years. And he was getting to be 18 and she was hopeful that he might reach out. But I put this story in there because no part of the reason that she cut off contact was because she didn't want a relationship with her child. And I think that's important to understand, is that when you're in a system that doesn't encourage genuine, radical connection and acceptance and allow that relationship to form in a way that is really child-centered, then you just have compounded trauma that further cuts it off. And the adoptive parents in that situation, I didn't interview them, but I'm speculating, what they could say is, oh, she doesn't want to have a relationship, right? Like, she's ended contact here. She's decided not to do these visits anymore. And that would be true, right? That was accurate. But it is, and so what that child might hear as he grows up is, oh, my mother has decided to cut off contact. She doesn't want to have a relationship with me. But it's so much more complicated than that, of course. And this is just one example, right? There are people are unique and different and want different things, and traumas manifest in different ways. So I don't want to oversimplify, but I think that this is a good example of how things can become, from an oversimplified standpoint, feed into these myths about adoption when you're motivated to uphold those myths rather than to understand the complexity of how people's lives are impacted by this.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I wanted to read a passage from your book, one of the many that resonated with me. On page 40, this one talks about the myth of the two-parent household. Unsurprisingly, children raised by parents in high conflict marriages are no better off than peers in single-parent households. For Black children, researchers have found that living in a one-parent household does not have the same cost as it has for their white peers, nor does living in a two-parent family carry a comparable benefit. This was a huge revelation because I've been in spats online about the myth of the single parent household and how important it is or not important it is, the single Black woman mother and how detrimental she is to the upbringing. And all of this was very affirming reading that, because it doesn't necessarily matter. And we can't blame the circumstances of the parents necessarily, when people so readily want to blame them in that way.
And when people talk about adoption offering a better life, you have to unpack the ways that we understand what a better life means. And for so often that means two parents. Sometimes two parents are better. It depends on which two parents you're talking about and what their relationship and what their community is. And so there are limits to the extent to which that's a benefit. But most of what we mean when we talk about better life is you're talking about money, right? You're talking about a middle class aspiration here. Which includes a two-parent family, right? That is a middle-class value in and of itself in the United States right now. And I think it's important to understand that you're talking about a very privileged, heteronormative, classed, raced way of thinking about which families are worthy, and what parenthood should look like, what home should look like, what children need to be stable and safe. And it's interesting. There was one woman whose story is included in the book. She had actually wanted to have an abortion. Most of the mothers that I interviewed didn't want to have an abortion, and she went through the gamut. She really wanted to parent. Her partner really didn't want to parent. She briefly considered having an abortion. She was too far along to get one. So then she turned to adoption, right? Kind of all the other options had been removed for her, or felt like they were removed from her. But what was interesting in her story is when she talked about her own upbringing, her mother was an immigrant. They grew up very poor. And she talks about how she felt growing up in a poor family had given her a lot of strength and resiliency and creativity and closeness with her extended family, and how they all took care of each other, right? But then when it comes time to assessing, what she wants for her child, she's, oh, they need a better life, right? And all that resiliency and connection and creativity that can come out of hardship is undervalued, because it's undervalued in our broader cultural idea of what children need. And look, I'm not trying to minimize the hardships of poverty, but I want to mitigate that for everyone. I think I'm not, but I am saying that we don't see the value of that in families. We just assume that poor families are inevitably less than. And poverty is what drives so much of relinquishment.
And your point about which family is worthy, that definitely hit home, because throughout your book, you talk about economics and how oftentimes lower income family relinquishes and then an upper income family adopts. And it's just this cycle that keeps on going round, and we can expect it. There are a handful of adoptees that I know of who actually were adopted into a poorer family than their original family because of shame and scandal that happened, right? But it's so important to really isolate this idea of better life and debunking that myth itself, because I don't believe that I live a better life even with my resources and education and all of it. I can't say that this necessarily is a better life, because everyone's definition is different, and everyone's definition of happiness and contentment and satisfaction are different, and definition of love is different. And for us to just assume that is the greater majority who aren't doing this kind of investigative work, to assume that just because there's a two-parent household, it's better, is just so absurd to me. It's so archaic in its thinking.
And it also is very fundamentally conservative, right? And I often say, like, adoption is both conservative in like how it's constructed in our political framework, but it's also conservative in that it's an understanding of where we should be making investment, right, as a society. And when we talk about, we put a lot of money into adoption, right? A lot of money goes into adoption. A lot of public money goes into adoption. A lot of private philanthropic money goes into adoption. It's all tax deductible. The adoption tax credit for adoptive families is really high. And when you look at that, we are choosing to make greater investments in middle-class families and more affluent families who want to adopt, when a similar investment in communities that are vulnerable to family separation would keep them together. And that can work in a lot of ways, right? So it can work in the microcosm of a lot of the women that I interviewed were relinquishing their children because they didn't have enough money, either because they were living in a chronic long-term poverty, or for some of them, simply, they might come from a middle-class family, but they were just broke. They didn't have their own money to control their own resources, and their family wasn't supportive of their parenting. So it was like, so anything that would make that sort of crisis poverty easier would allow families to stay together. But also and Dorothy Roberts, in her incredible book, Torn Apart, talks about this as well in the context of the public adoption system and foster care, where when you increase food subsidies in a community by 5%, you see a 14% reduction in child welfare removals of children. Because once you demonize parenting and poverty, you interpret poverty as neglect, and then you have a justification to remove older children, right? And also, the chronic stress of living in poverty is more likely to lead to child maltreatment, right? Where when you alleviate those conditions, you are creating safety for families. But again, we choose to put money into foster care and child welfare and removing children from families, and then subsidizing children within the foster families, rather than putting the investments into the communities that would allow children to stay with their families of origin. Because we consistently view adoption and the transfer of babies and children to other families that we deem more deserving as a better solution than just giving families the resources that they need to keep their children safe and secure and thriving where they are.
The statistics behind and the percentage of white mothers relinquishing more than and BIPOC mothers was really fascinating to me. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah. And this is actually a really interesting moment to be studying private adoption, because I think that this is shifting really quickly. And I think that in another 5 to 10 years, you might have a completely different situation. I'm very clear that my research is documenting this window of adoptions from 2000 to 2020. But when you look at the history of private adoption, certainly before Roe versus Wade, and really through the 90s, it was almost entirely white women that were participating in the private adoption system, because that's where the market demand was for white babies and children. And that doesn't mean, of course, that Black families and other families of color were protected from family separation. It just wasn't happening within the private adoption system, right? So it was largely happening within foster care removals or other ways of diminishing those bonds. But the market demand was for white children. And so white mothers were targeted by the private adoption industry. There's not great data on the demographics of relinquishing mothers. The federal government stopped tracking that. It is an endless frustration to me as a researcher. But the best data that we have that looks at the early 90s really showed that it was over 95% of women relinquishing through the private system were white women. What you see then was fewer and fewer white women were participating. So even though the proportion of white women was really high, you were talking about fewer and fewer women. And that's when you see the rise in international adoption, right? Because there just aren't enough American white babies available. And really, international adoption was marketed in a way that allowed white families to feel more comfortable adopting children of color. And you see that. So as international adoption increased, first waves from Russia and Ukraine, those were white children. Then you see a shift to Central and Latin America, Asia, China, Korea, certainly. And then toward the tail end of the international adoption wave, then you see more children from Africa, Haiti. Those are, of course, Black children, right? So you see a shift in who is viewed as an eligible member of a white family with white parents, right? Which adoptees are going to be marketable to white prospective adoptive parents. And Elizabeth Raleigh is a sociologist who has really traced she has an excellent book called Selling Transracial Adoption that really looks at how adoptees of color were framed for white prospective adoptive parents. And I think that is a really important transition. And once international adoption fell off very quickly in the early 2000s, then you saw American prospective adoptive parents who were more willing to adopt from foster care, which is, of course, disproportionately children of color. Then within the private system, which again had been historically so white, you do see more and more women of color participating in that system now. There's a couple of reasons that's happening. One is that the market is no longer limited to white children, right? White parents are now very comfortable adopting children that are not white. So the market is more willing to target any vulnerable pregnant person, not just white pregnant women. And I think that has been an important shift. Now, it's still majority white women that are participating, but it is no longer disproportionately white, right? So it's just over half. So my sample goes from 2000 to 2020 for the adoption. So my sample is disproportionately white, but I think that marks a shift that happened in those 20 years. And I think that if you were to look at the next 20 years from now until 2044, you're going to see more and more women of color that are engaged in the private system.
I was adopted from Haiti, and so your remarks on Haiti really hit home for me. What do you think is the impact of missionaryism on international adoption?
Yes, that is a big, whenever folks want to talk about missionary work or the way that the church is engaged, Catherine Joyce's book, The Child Catchers and the New Gospel of Adoption, I think is really the quintessential text for looking at the ways that American evangelical church and other conservative religions have impacted this, particularly through missionary work. So much of international adoption is non-secular, happens within religious institutions. And so much of it is so deeply extractive, particularly at times of crisis in a country. So countries that are exporting their children are usually at a moment of economic or geopolitical instability for some reason. It can be tied to the AIDS epidemic in Africa at the time. We saw an uptick in extractive removals from Haiti after the earthquake and the aftermath of that. Whenever a country is in an unstable place, then you see a lot more international adoption. And that's because you see a lot more targeting by international adoption agencies, which include missionaries. And I think that we see that now. So after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine closed off private adoptions. For the time, they said, we cannot, this is not a priority for us right now, basically. And you see the United States Congress has now issued a resolution encouraging Ukraine to reopen for international adoption, right? This is driven by the demands of American agencies and American prospective adoptive parents who want Ukraine to prioritize this exporting of their children at this time. And so you see a country that's vulnerable that has said, we can't process these adoptions now. And you see the United States saying, oh, but maybe make this a priority at the time. And you see this whenever a country is thrown, disarray sounds an understatement for what's happening in Ukraine, but anytime a country is put in a vulnerable place by virtue of conflict, natural disaster, and you have a situation that's more likely to lead to child removals.
When it comes to kinship adoption and adopting within the culture, I know a lot of indigenous laws not a lot, but a few indigenous laws were erected to protect the indigenous culture itself. What are your thoughts around that? And why do you think that's not more prevalent and the first thought when people want to adopt?
So the best example of this is the Indian Child Welfare Act, right? Which is a federal policy that says that if a Native child is removed from or relinquished by a tribal member, if either their parents are tribal members, and the tribe has a role to play in where that child is placed, right? So prioritizing a direct kinship placement or someone else within that child's tribe or within another Native family if they can't find someone within that child's own tribe. And this, of course, was a response to the very aggressive child removal policies through the Native boarding school era, which always goes more recently than people think, and then into the Indian Adoption Project, which didn't end until the 1970s, which was the removal of Native children for placement with white families. And so ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, called ICWA, is a protection against this, to allow tribes to have some say in where Native children are placed. And it remains law. There was a case last year that was a really existential challenge to ICWA. We managed to hold on to that in the Supreme Court, but these challenges to ICWA come up repeatedly, and I don't expect that they will go away. Now, because the relationship between the United States government and the tribes is unique, these distinctions are possible. But other communities that are vulnerable to family separation have made similar efforts. So the National Association of Black Social Workers decades ago came out with a statement saying we should try to keep Black children in Black families, right? That is where they belong. Now, because being Black in America is not recognized as a unique political identity the same way that being a tribal member isn't, there isn't such a policy in place. And so you still see disproportionate child removals within the public adoption system of Black families. That doesn't mean there's nothing that we can do, right? So Minnesota recently passed a policy that says that children are members of communities that are disproportionately impacted by foster care removals. There is an investment in trying to keep children in their communities with kinship placements if possible. There has also been federal policy to support foster care kinship placements at the same level that we support non-kinship foster care placements. So it used to be if a child is removed and they're put with a non-kinship foster care family, then that family is given more support to care for that child. But if they're removed and they're placed with an auntie or a grandmother, that's not supported in the same way financially. And so that is a shift in policy that we're seeing. And there's goodness, so much more work to be done around keeping children in families and communities of origin. It's a little trickier when it comes to private adoption because the state isn't as directly involved, and because relinquishing mothers are told by agencies, you can pick the families that you want to pick. But what's interesting to me is the Black mothers that I interviewed who were relinquishing, they all wanted to have a Black parent for their child, but so often they had to make compromises around that. So there was one mother I interviewed who said, I'm not going to relinquish my baby unless you can find Black parents for him. And the agency didn't seem to, from her perspective, didn't seem to try that hard to find a Black adoptive family for her child. And so she ended up placing her child with 2 white parents who already had adopted a Black child, so that at least he wouldn't be the only Black person in that household as he was growing up. But it was always present, right? It was always a priority, but the agencies weren't always motivated, or if motivated, weren't able to accommodate that for a lot of mothers. And the other thing I remind people of is that a lot of the white mothers I interviewed, had biracial children. And the extent to which they thought about the fact that if they chose white adoptive parents, their child was going to be a transracial adoptee varied a lot. And so oftentimes their own whiteness and their own white privilege didn't lead them to be thinking about the complexity of their child's racial identity. Sometimes it did, but oftentimes they would say, he's light-skinned, so I wasn't that worried about that, right? And so you see a lot of white mothers placing biracial children in entirely white families and communities that don't necessarily give them space to understand themselves in that way. So I feel like I've gotten a little bit far afield from your original question.
No, not at all.
But,
it's all so interesting.
I think it's very complicated how we think about how we value keeping children in families and communities that look like them, whether or not they are actually their biological family of origin. And we certainly don't value that in most cases.
No, I don't think it is valued. It is coming to the forefront as an acknowledgement, which is exciting. But I know that when I was growing up, it definitely was not valued. The whole concept of better life was more present than anything else, because this idea of white supremacy, right? Of these white families are going to be better just intrinsically than any brown family it's a hurdle for a lot of adoptees who were transracial. I actually go by interracial, international. Can you define transracial for me? A lot of adoptees didn't come across that word until actually 2020. And that's when I understood that apparently I'm transracial. But after doing some investigative work, I was just like, that doesn't work for me, just because trans being to erase. But I would love to hear your definition of transracial.
Yeah. And to be clear, when it comes to this language on adoption is so hard. It's so hard.
Yeah, it is.
Language that everybody is comfortable with. And in the book, I'm very intentional about using the words that people use to describe themselves and trying to be as inclusive as possible. And it's not always going to work. But transracial adoption, as I intended, as I have seen it used and learned from adoptee communities that I've been in conversation with, is when you have children of a certain racial background that are being raised in a family that doesn't entirely mirror that racial background. Now, it's interesting what this can mean. Oftentimes, most commonly means a child of color is being raised by white parents.
Yes.
just because that is the most common example of what transracial adoption looks like in the United States. But Susan Ito, who's an adoptee memoirist, she wrote a brilliant book called I Would Meet You Anywhere. She's half Japanese, half white by birth, and she was raised by two Japanese American parents. So she talks about her understanding of being something of a because I think she says half transracial adoptee in some ways, because she has a white parent and she was raised by two wholly Japanese American parents, and talking about how that has led her to have a slightly different racial identity than the family that she was raised with. And I think that is interesting. So I think it can mean a lot of different things. And whether you use transracial or interracial, I think that using the words that feel right to you and speaking with respect can take you in any different direction. Trying to find something that encompasses all this diversity of experience. But that's what I mean when I use it. So
that works for me. I love that definition because it's broad and it's more encompassing. So I appreciate that. I was just curious because you're an expert as to what your thoughts on it was. A lot of us adoptees are just like feeling out this language, trying to really isolate what works for us, distill what feels good in our identity, which is still evolving and in motion. On page 42, you talk about a conference of researchers and lobbyists that never asked the question, why do we want to increase adoption? It was a cohort of people trying to figure out how to boost adoption in the States, but they weren't asking the question, why do we want to increase adoption? Why do you think that is?
first, I want to say I have no idea why I was invited to this meeting, and I'm probably never going to invite me back now that I've written it. And I went to try to understand where they were coming from. This was in 2020, spring of 2020. It was right after the pandemic started. It was during the Trump administration, and it was organized at the behest of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And what they were looking at was a declining rate of domestic infant adoption. Our infant adoption numbers are low. They have been gradually, slightly declining for a long time. And the people on this call were saying, this is inevitably a bad thing, right? Because they were coming to this from the framework of adoption is a good thing. So adoption going down must mean that we need to, have an intervention in some way to increase adoption numbers. And I was like, all right, I'll go to this meeting and see what you're saying. Because that framing is so anathema to my understanding of adoption, having done research in this space, that if adoption is going down because people are better able to plan their pregnancies, less likely to have an unplanned pregnancy, have better control over their reproductive lives and greater autonomy, are better able to support and care for the children that they have with the partners that they have or don't have at the time. All of these things are where my values are, right? If we're giving people greater control over their lives, then you're inevitably going to see the adoption rate go down, because adoption is an expression of constraint and resourcelessness. And so I wanted to see how this conversation went. And the ideas that they had for increasing adoption, a lot of education. We need to educate people more about adoption. We haven't seen that to be true. People know about adoption. They just generally aren't interested in it. People don't usually want to relinquish their children if they have another path available. And you saw people talking about marketing at adoption agencies and marketing at abortion clinics and intervening in this way. We just need to tell more people about this. We need to include discussion of adoption in sex ed curricula. These were their sort of ideas for how they were going to increase the number of adoptions. And then there some more aggressive suggestions as well. I could have told you, if you want to increase the adoption rate, just cut your social safety net and ban abortion. Those are both morally reprehensible suggestions, but they'll get your adoption rate to go up. But what was struck me most is no one in that conversation, except for me at the end, questioned the premise of this meeting. Why do we want the rate to go up? What is so inherently good about adoption that when it goes down, it means that something has gone awry? Because, and I don't, of course, don't accept that premise. But I think that the meeting itself was informative for understanding that the government does see an investment in making adoption more frequent, or that government did, certainly.
There are certain adoption agencies who are notorious for coercion, manipulation, and misinformation. Why do you think it's hard for adoptees and birth parents to hold them to account?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, adoption agencies have a lot of power. They have a lot of lawyers at their disposal, and they have a lot more resources than certainly than relinquishing parents and then most adoptees. And I think that's important. A lot of the mothers that I interviewed had really interesting relationships with their agencies after the adoption was completed. So some of them they all went through a period of grief and mourning right after the adoption, almost all of them. But so many of them were told, you've been so brave. You've made such a heroic, good choice for your child. And when you're in a place of grief and you have any organization that's telling you you're brave, you're heroic, this is beautiful, this is a wonderful thing that you did, a lot of them latched on to that. Right. And went into this adoption honeymoon phase that I write about in the book, where even though they were sad, they were really optimistic about what adoption was going to do for them and their child, right? This is going to be, even if they were sad, they had given their child a better life, and thus it was beautiful. That's what they were still told. And this is when a lot of the agencies will say, would you want to write a blog post for us to put online? You want to make a video for us to put online? Do you want to come talk to a group of prospective adoptive parents about how wonderful your adoption is? And you see a lot of birth parents that are encouraged to showcase this moment where they're talking about how beautiful the adoption is. Now, over time, almost all of them came to a very critical way of understanding their adoption, because that acclaim, that pedestal that they were put on, didn't come with any support. It didn't make room for their grief. It didn't make room for their struggles with the open adoption relationships. It didn't make room for disappointment when contact was limited or cut off. And a lot of the mothers said, my agency completely failed me in the long term, right? The adoptive parents have cut me off. They haven't offered me any recourse. They haven't offered me any counseling or support, but they still have that blog post that I wrote 6 months after the adoption up on their website. Right. Or when I started doing the data collection in 2010, a lot of message boards that was where a lot of mothers were finding each other, where they were gathering, where they were talking. And a lot of these message boards were run by agencies. And so they would have new mothers that were joining these message boards. And as soon as anyone said anything critical about the agency or about adoption generally, they'd get kicked off the message board, right? So a lot of ways that these mothers were really intentionally silenced when they came to a more critical place. There's also more extreme examples, right? So there was a relinquishing mother who made really egregious claims of fraud and coercion against her agency. And she was very public about this on social media, posted blogs, made YouTube videos talking about her. The agency sued her to take them down. Now, I can't, the legal review for my book was very clear. I can't make claims on the merits of what she was claiming. But what I do want to say is, they only have to sue a few birth mothers to be silent before a lot of other mothers around them see that and say, I'm just going to stay quiet for now. And so agencies intentionally they uplift the positive voices very prominently. And they really cut off and silence more critical voices very intentionally.
That's so disheartening. It's so extremely disheartening to hear that, and how much power these huge agencies have. I was recently in Minneapolis, and that's a huge hub for adoption. And I was in this show, and because Korean adoptees take up so much numbers in adoption, I just guessed that my other cast members, two Asian men, happened to be adopted. I guessed. I was like, I think they're adopted. And so one by one, I went up to them and I was just like, hey, I'm adopted. I'm wondering, are you adopted? And they're like, yeah. both of them. And I had never had that experience before, but I knew because Minneapolis, again, is just a breeding ground for these kind of situations. I actually went to a reunion when I was a kid in Minneapolis, and I didn't know what was happening. I wasn't really self-possessed enough to enjoy it or take any benefits from it, but I knew that I was meeting my biological cousins at the time. And so it's just really interesting watching how these industries move. And a lot of times when I speak to people outside of the constellation, they use child-centeredness as an excuse for adoption, as if the child is at the apex of a lot of the reasonings behind this kind of behavior. But then I listen to you and I listen to other experts, and children aren't even brought into this conversation. They're not even at the center of these conversations. What do you think about that?
And again, I just want to give the caveat. My research isn't really adoptee centered, right? Like just because it's not on adoptee experiences, I tried to conduct it and write it in such a way that it does feel accountable to adoptees, right? I wanted it to feel like it valued their experiences. But if my research is on mothers and the circumstance under which the separations occur. So I do want to give that caveat. I listened, when I would take a break, when I was writing, I would take a break from writing and I would go on a walk, and I would listen to a lot of adoptee memoirs while I was going for a walk as a way of keeping adoptee voices in my head, literally, as I was writing, because I did want it to feel like I was valuing and centering that experience, even if that wasn't the exact research question. But to get back to what you're saying, so little of this is about what children actually need. Because if it was about what children need and not about what adults want, then we would be supporting families where they are. Domestic adoption is relatively rare, right? There's about 20,000 domestic adoptions of infants every year. There are millions of American families living in poverty every year, children born into families living in poverty. So if this was actually about caring for children, we wouldn't be focusing all this attention on adoption. We would be focusing on caring for children in the families where they are, because you're always going to have so many more children being raised in these vulnerable families than you are being separated from families. And things like housing security, food security, child care, health care, all of those things that would actually care for children, we struggle with, right? We have not been able to implement that in any systematic way. We love adoption because adoption is about centering what these adoptive parents want, right? That's the mechanism that's being served. They want children, and adoption serves that and meets that need, even as we are perfectly willing to not address the needs of other children who are staying with their families. But people say this all the time, where, oh, if you're critical of adoption, it means that you want children to stay in unsafe homes. What if a parent is homeless? What if a parent has a severe mental illness? What if they're struggling with addiction? What if they're incarcerated? And my response is always, well, you're thinking too narrowly, right? I don't want a child to be living in homelessness, but I don't want the parent to be living with housing instability either, right? Why isn't that person housed? I don't want that person to be struggling with addiction. What are we doing to get them the care that they need so that they can parent? The incarceration one is interesting. I was like, yeah, we need to deal with incarceration. But you're looking at the ways that adoption is built on all these other injustices and inequalities as a way of justifying it, rather than saying, how are we caring for people more deeply and more broadly so that they can care for children? I am not making the argument that every parent is prepared to raise every child to whom they give birth at any point in their lives, right? I'm not making that argument. It's not true, right? Not everybody is equipped to parent at every time. But I am questioning whether permanently, fully, legally separating the child from a parent is the best way of caring for them long term. if that's really about the child's needs. Now, if we need to find other spaces of care for that child, great. If we need to find other spaces of care for that parent to get what they need to be able to raise that child if they want to, great. Let's think about this more broadly, more systematically. How are we failing communities? How are we failing individuals? And how can we make different decisions about how to prioritize the work to be done?
That's so important to think about the root of the issue. And a lot of people skip over that, not understanding that the Chinese babies who became available after one child nation, the one child mandate was implemented, were because they were being abducted from their homes. And no one's doing that investigative work. Not no one, I'm speaking in absolutes. There are people out there that are doing the investigative work, and good for you. But a great majority, about 5, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I know when my mom adopted me, this work wasn't being done to really understand, why are these babies available? Why are these children displaced and without their parental guidance?
And so much coming out, particularly out of Central and South America, for children that were just trafficked, right? Just trafficked in the service of the American adoption industry. And I think that the international adoption wave was really through the 90s, peaked in 2004, fell off pretty abruptly. So many of those children are not children anymore, right? These are adults who are reckoning with how they have come to lead the lives that they have and what forces shaped them. And I think that so much of the activism and the energy in this movement is coming from, the communities of adopted people that are drawing attention to this. And I think that we're starting to see some more reporting on that coming out, particularly around international adoption. And I think that is part of the reason why I think it's driven by the adoptees. And I'm encouraged that more attention is being paid to domestic adoption as well. I think because, and I come from a reproductive justice space, right? And I think that the Dobbs decision and the political rights continual introduction of adoption as a solution to abortion, as a response to abortion bans, is bringing to light a lot of the really conservative underpinnings of adoption and making people more inclined to understand how adoption actually functions. Because for so long, liberals, progressives, people left of center have accepted adoption as a meaningful and necessary social good. And I think that we are coming to a point where people are more ready and willing to look at it critically.
International adoptions are more regulated than domestic adoptions. Is that correct?
Well, they're better counted. So we have better data on them for sure. That's because the State Department tracks international adoptions because it involves bringing non-citizen children into the country. So we have better information about international adoption. We have very poor numbers on domestic adoption, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's better regulated. I think we just have better data collection around it, because I think that so much of what happens outside of the United States, obviously, right? We don't necessarily know what agencies are doing on the ground in other countries, what churches and missionaries are, what those circumstances of separation are. We know how many are arriving in the United States, but we don't necessarily, because it's literally outside of US regulation in a lot of ways when it happens in the countries of origin.
Data collection is really important to a lot of adoptees. What can we do as adoptees, as decent human beings, to help with the regulation of these adoptions, to extract and collect the information that we seek, such as health, histories, and name of families, where the families are, all of those things? What can we do to help expedite the regulation of adoption industry?
So there is a federal bill right now in front of Congress to track the number of domestic adoptions that are happening. It's a bipartisan bill. I think it's just called the Adoption Counts Act. That's very baseline data collection, right? But it is the first step, right? It is necessary, but not sufficient. We have to get this done because we need to know who we're talking about, right? And how many adoptions we're talking about so that we can understand the impact of different policies. First step. Second step is there is another bill that is looking to limit the ways that agencies, not agencies, but the way that unlicensed brokers can advertise online. So when I talk about some of the really aggressive targeting of vulnerable families that happens, that a lot of that is done by people who aren't actually even licensed adoption providers. They're just paid intermediaries. That would ban paid intermediaries on a federal level. So that's called the Adoption Deserves Oversight, Protection, and Transparency, I think. And that would limit the roles that unlicensed intermediaries play in the advertising space. I think that is a good first step. There's a lot more that we have to do. On the federal level, that's what's happening. On the state level, there's a lot more going on. So several states have passed really good original birth certificate access bills. I think that's important. And I always say we had a great one in Vermont and we had a great one in South Dakota in the last few years. And if Vermont and South Dakota can agree on something in their very different state legislatures, then we should be able to get this through in more states. And I think that's important. I also think that the policy I mentioned earlier that came out of Minnesota about, and this is less about access for people who've already been adopted and more about reorienting how we understand adoption to keep more children in communities of origin. I think that bill could hopefully serve as a model for things to happen in other states. So we're seeing some legislation and some policy change that I think is bringing some promise forward. And then in the public space, right, I know the Movement for Family Power, JMAC for Families in New York, they're doing a lot of work on giving people basically Miranda rights before their children are removed, so that parents can be better informed to know their rights before a social worker comes and removes their child for foster care, and to give them better resources for understanding that. Again, just like a low bar here, but a lot of things that are happening that I think are exciting and could move us towards a different way of understanding, create change. But of course, the most meaningful movement around family preservation, is not going to have anything to do with adoption necessarily, right? Because the policies that are going to most impact adoption are the policies that are going to avert the adoptions entirely. So things, again, like more housing programs, a better social safety net, better access to childcare, better access to healthcare, anything that makes parenting easier, that cares for families, is going to keep families together. And so I always encourage people that are really eager for policy change, that want to be part of that conversation, to think about how do you build coalition outside of the immediate community, people who are impacted by adoption. I think that we can when we look at these broader conversations of support and care, people who are doing that work aren't necessarily going to understand it in relation to adoption, but making it part of that conversation is how you build coalition to create greater change and how you shift which families we're valuing.
I'm interested to know more about your abortion on-screen database. It's really awesome. I just want to talk more about it because I started looking at the list and of course I recognized a lot of those films, but why is it important and what is it?
Yeah. So this is, I've had two primary areas of research over my career. One, of course, is this work on adoption. And the other one is really on our pop cultural conversations about reproduction and decision-making, focusing on abortion storytelling, how we tell stories about abortion. But of course, if you've read the book, you know that I believe pop culture is really important to understanding all of these things. And one of the chapters in the book really looks at a lot of these pop cultural narratives around adoption and how they feed these cultural myths and ideas of what adoption looks like and who it serves. So to me, they're very interconnected. But when you talk about things like abortion, there's so much stigma. Everybody knows someone who's had an abortion. Everybody cares about someone who's had an abortion, but we don't always know that we know someone who's had an abortion, right? Because it's kept secret. And so the stories that we see on film and television television take on an oversized significance, right? Because we don't have a lot of real life framing for how many people are impacted, around why, around what support looks like. And so that program has been really fun to try to look at what do these stories mean? How do they impact audiences? Whose stories are told in our cultural conversations and whose are missing? And it's, to me, there's a lot that unites these two areas of research, but it's really about whose stories are not being told in part of this broader cultural conversation, and what are the rest of us misunderstanding because they are missing.
Have you seen the French film He Has Your Eyes?
I have not seen that one, no.
Put that on your list, because
Okay.
that is about adoption. It's about a Senegalese couple
Okay.
who want to adopt, and they're in France, and they end up getting a white child with blue eyes, and how that is, it just creates this uproar in their community, because they're just like, who is this white child? And she's out in the park with him, and everyone thinks she's the nanny. So it really examines through comedy and lightheartedness just the racial undertones of adoption, of transracial adoption.
Mhm.
And I just love that film. It's such a great example of how complex it is. It's so layered and nuanced, and it's not just one size fits all. In your book, when you talk about 16 and pregnant couple and how they were deemed selfless and courageous and compassionate and all of those great things, what does that mean for the adoptive parent receiving them? That was really a powerful statement. What does that mean if the birth family is exhibiting altruism? What does that make the adopters?
What I think is interesting is that when you have these narratives of adoption as so beautiful, everybody's being selfless, right? Like the adoptive parents are being selfless and altruistic by adopting. The relinquishing parents are being selfish selfless and altruistic by giving the child this better. Everybody's just being giving, and nobody, and I'm like, then who's actually getting what they want,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And nobody kind of interrogates, not everybody can just be endlessly giving in this scenario, because I think the premise is that it's about the child and serving the child in both ways. But of course, it's not that, right? And I think that when you see, when both the narrative of relinquishment and adoption are selflessness, you're not seeing who it's actually serving, right? Who's actually shaping this story. And look, I don't think it's necessarily selfish to want to have children, right? I have 3 children, and I don't think it was selfish to want them, but I had them because I wanted them. I don't think it was selfless of me to have them either. This is, I wanted to be a mother. I wanted to raise children. I wanted that to be part of my life. That's why I had them. And I think that adoptive parents adopt for a range of reasons, but some of them are just as basic as the reason anybody has children. But I don't think that's selfless. I don't think that's altruistic to do that. And I think that it's important to recognize that you're doing that in large part because of what you want for your own life. And I don't think we see that around adoptive parents often.
I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's either this or that. And I think in adoption, there's this idea of goodness. What's good? What's the good choice? And anything else is bad and should be damned and should be rebuked. And I don't think that's right. And one of the things I appreciated about your book was that it's nuanced. There's so many different layers. There's just not one reason that people relinquish. It's not always because of drugs. Often it's not. It's because of a variety of reasons. A lot have to do with economics, a stability. And so for us to just constantly go into this is good, this is bad, I don't think it serves the industry. It doesn't serve the children that should be at the center of the conversation. That's just my thoughts on that.
I think that's very true. And what that we've talked about has been about adults.
Yeah.
And what adults need and want. And I'm not dismissing that. I think adults are people who have the right to have their own desires and complexities and nuance. But let's be clear who this system is shaped by. And I think that's important too.
Yeah. I definitely want to just hear some thoughts on Project 20 before you go. You had some great statements on Instagram about how it's affecting abortion. I just want to hear a little bit more from you about that.
Yeah. So look, Republicans just constantly want adoption to be the answer. And they're not the only ones, right? Like they have plenty of bipartisan support for policies in favor of adoption. Everybody wants adoption to be the common ground, but particularly they want it to be the answer to abortion because they don't want to be viewed as imposing parenthood on people when they've banned abortion access. Now, a study that I worked on looked at what happens when people are denied access to abortion, and only over 90% of them are parenting the children that are born. Only 9% are relinquishing as a result of being denied abortion care. So adoption is only going to go so far, right? You're going to have far more people that are parenting in circumstances they did not choose or plan as a result of these bans. And nothing in Project 2025 really accounts for how you're going to make their lives possible, because it's really about transferring children and what we can do, who else's desires can be met by this when they're talking about adoption. But Project 2025 talks about the opposition is just the beginning, right? And how else are we going to further restrict abortion access in the states and encourage birth or mandate birth, I should say. And it does have a line in there about further promoting adoption. And we're still seeing the consequences of Dobbs play out, right? Where this is going to be long-term impacts. The state laws are changing in different ways. It's hard to know exactly when we're going to have clarity on what access looks like in each state. But we have also, some states are already doing this aggressive promotion of adoption. So Texas has this modern adoption campaign that they're putting out, and they're putting just millions of state dollars into promoting adoption rather than putting any state money into actually supporting families. They're going to be continually marketing adoption. They are specifically in Texas targeting this advertising in Black and Brown communities, which is why I think we're going to see even more of a shift in who's participating in private adoption. You're going to start to see even more women of color that are relinquishing within private systems. They're targeting them there because those communities have higher rates of abortion, largely because they have higher rates of unintended pregnancy. They have less access to other healthcare, including birth control. So they have high rates of unintended pregnancy. But they're really selling the idea of adoption as a meaningful alternative here. And I think that if Trump is elected again and we see Project 2025 go into effect, we're going to see more and more examples of adoption being marketed as the solution here, even for people who aren't considering abortion or aren't trying to get an abortion, whether or not they can. And I think that anything that frames adoption as the panacea, right? Anything that sort of gives into this very glossy marketing is not making any space for any of the complexity or nuance of experience that you and I have been talking about. It just wants adoption to be the answer. It doesn't mean that it's making adoption more child-centered. It doesn't mean that it's providing long-term support for adopted people and relinquishing parents. It just wants it to be this political answer without any accounting for the reality of what it looks like for people who are impacted. And I think we're going to continue to see more of that on the state level, regardless of whether Project 2025 moves forward, but very certainly if it is.
Do you think that adoption is the cure to abortion?
No, I mean, abortion has always been more common than adoption. Even when you look at, we don't have great rates of abortion before Roe v. Wade, of course, because it was illegal. It's hard to get a good count on illegal behavior. But even during the height of the baby scoop era, which was the highest that domestic adoption has ever been in this country, and even when abortion was illegal in every single state, you still had 8 times as many abortions as you did adoptions. And you still see that today. We have pre-doms, there were about 20,000 adoptions. There were 850,000 to 1 million abortions per year. Abortion is just a very common reproductive experience, right? We forget that. And adoption and relinquishment are relatively rare. 1 in 4, 3 or 4 women, American women, will have an abortion at some point in their reproductive lives. Less than 1% will relinquish a child, right? These aren't even comparable. And so when you talk about banning abortion or promoting adoption, adoption's not the common ground in the abortion conversation. Parenting is, right? And as much as I don't want women relinquishing because they can't afford a child that they would otherwise prepare to parent, I don't want people having abortions because they can't afford a child that they would otherwise prefer to have in their lives. And when we make adoption the solution, people aren't interested in it. They aren't pursuing it. And you're overlooking the common ground of how do we support families? What does that look like? How do we value keeping children in the families and communities where they're born and making sure that those communities are thriving places for another generation? Which is why adoption is so uncreative of a solution to how we think about where we are making our social investment.
Thank you so much for joining me, Gretchen.
Having me. And thank you for your great questions. So,
what's next for you? Should we be looking out for another book?
I hope to write another book. I'm still figuring out exactly what it's going to be. It will probably be not directly about adoption. It will probably be about like broader reproductive politics and families. So it'll always, to me, that's always about adoption, but it will probably be less explicitly about adoption. As someone, again, who's not like personally impacted, I want to be careful that I'm like leaving space for adopted people and relinquishing parents to be having their own expertise and experience and voices here. So that's important to me. But I have a couple talks coming up this fall. I'll be in Ann Arbor, in Michigan, in Denver, and Minneapolis.